So, in part one of this series of videos, I sort of highlighted what I wanted to do was look at the ways in which we as learners can up our game in terms of what we do and how we learn and how effectively we learn in the classroom or indeed anywhere. And I mentioned the last time a lady called Carol Dweck. She wrote a book called Mindsets some years back, and it's become incredibly influential. Basic idea is that we have a tendency, at least recently, and certainly in terms of education, theory, etc., to think of a fixed mindset. And by that, it is people have certain abilities and they are endowed with those abilities, and there are certain abilities that they are simply not endowed with, that they simply don't have. And she's argued quite persuasively for an alternative thinking on that, and that is the adaptation of what's known as a growth mindset. In other words, that you can learn new skills, you can acquire new abilities, etc. If you put enough effort in, if you're in a good context, and all the rest of it. And I agree largely with her point of view on that. I'm no expert on educational psychology, but my own experience is that we can fare better, I think, if we move from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. And I brought in an earlier psychology theorist in relation to this, a guy called Kurt Lewin, who's an American psychologist whose first half of the 20th century was his main work. His most prominent works came out in the 1940s before he passed away. And what he added to this was the concept of aspiration levels. What that basically meant, as I mentioned the last time, is that if people are given to pursue and achieve a certain goal, then their level of aspiration raises with that. That they seek further improvement on the basis that they've now reached this particular milestone. So that sort of speaks to Carol Dweck's point of view. But what I want to do in this video is explore something a little bit less simplistic, if I may. And that's not to argue against Dweck or Lewin, for that matter, but to argue for the addition of something else. Because while I believe that Carol Dweck's position on mindsets is correct, I think it's not only valid, I think it's also necessary. But in that age-old adage, it's also not sufficient. And what I mean by that is the necessity to become aware of something a little bit more deep than that. And I think that the growth versus fixed mindset and the advocacy for the growth mindset is fine. It works, it's necessary, but it's a little bit limited in terms of understanding how we can undertake that kind of improvement. Because it tends very much to focus, and this is the central argument of this short video, it tends very much to focus on the individual. That it's up to us, that we can do it, that we simply, try and fix ourselves, as it were. Whereas I think we need to argue for something a little bit in addition to that. And what I'm arguing for here, what I'm sort of pursuing here, is the idea of an educational worldview. Because there's an element of diagnostic in this. We can't operate as individuals in a social setting. We're individuals in the sense that we are our own person and all the rest of it. But our attitudes, our beliefs, our worldview, our systems of thinking, etc., are all shaped by social forces around us. And I want to explore that a little bit in this video. So we're shaped by these social forces, and worldviews are fairly complicated things, and I'm going to get into them a little bit more in future videos. But for now, I just want to sort of flag for people who are watching these videos that you as an individual have a certain amount of control over what, how, and how well you learn. But it's also important that you recognize those things that you don't have control over. You're raised in a certain setting, you're imbued with certain values, with certain ways of thinking, etc. And those too are important. Not because we can't overcome them, but because we need to know what they are before we try to overcome them. And we will have to recognize too that there are some things that we simply can't overcome. And that's not to adopt any kind of a defeatist attitude towards learning, but it is to recognize that we are not unique atomized individuals. We're individuals placed very much in a social context, and we need to be aware of that social context and its influence on us as learners and as individuals. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to unpack that idea of worldviews in part 3, and I hope you join me then for that.